This conference is really a case of what Marshall McLuhan said when he said the medium is the message, because the talks have been themselves inspirational and just exciting for me, and I think for all of us. And I really learned a lot, and it's been very pleased to meet you. And anyway, it's been an honor and a pleasure to be here. So thank you very much. I'm going to talk to you about an emotion, and I'll explain why we call it kama muta. You'll see that it overlaps a lot with what is sometimes called elevation. I would say, roughly speaking, the phenomenon is, 85% overlap with what people are identifying as elevation, but our theory of it is very different. And many of the things that people refer to as inspirational are kama muta moments, although there are other kinds of inspiration as well. So I want to start by, potentially giving you a chance to experience this.
Hi, my name is Tina Escher. I'm 10 years old and I go to Randolph Elementary School. My dad, Master Sergeant Joe Myers, is in Iraq right now.
Well, we could watch those for a long time, and probably that would be more fun than my talk. I want to tell you our theory about this, and I'm not going to tell you the data because there are two talks right after lunch that present some of the studies. We've done quite a few studies, but I want to present the theory, the idea here. Okay, and to begin with, the theory meshes with or is embedded in relational models theory, which posits the existence of four basic really fundamental relational models that people use to coordinate their social life. And one of them is communal sharing. And communal sharing is roughly equivalent to the idea of love, the English word love, but in the broad sense of the sense of connection that you might have, a sense of equivalence, a sense of oneness that you have with one or more other people. So when you coordinate in a communal sharing mode, you coordinate according to something that you feel some sense of equivalence, some sense of oneness. And it can be a decision that you make in common, like we just make this by consensus, or it can be, well, what's mine is yours, this is our common property, or we have a joint responsibility or a joint task or something like that. So in some respect, people are undifferentiated. So there are many, many examples in everyday life, and it can occur at different levels of intensity across cultures. And the cultures, as we will talk about toward the end of the talk, the culture provides the templates, the prototypes and precedents and paradigms for what is a communal relationship in your culture, because you may not have a compadre or a blood brother, but some people do. Some people have an age mate, and for those people that could be the strongest communal relationship in the society. If you If your culture provides you with a loving deity, the most intense forms of communal sharing may be with that deity. If your culture doesn't, then they won't be. And you can feel communal sharing with, all of humankind or all sentient beings or whatever, right? So it can be very narrow, it can be strong or weak, and so forth. So what causes kama muta is it's a particular relational dynamic, a particular change, and it's the sudden intensification of a communal sharing relationship. Now, it's not about the level, it's not about how much love there is, it's about the sudden change, right? It's the acceleration, if you like. It's a difference. And if communal sharing intensifies in a more gradual way, even over the course of 20 minutes or an hour, you don't feel kama muta. You may get very close, but you don't feel kama muta. If it intensifies over the course of hours or days, it can get very intense, but you never feel this emotion. You feel this emotion when there's a sudden change. And there's a lot of interesting functional, phylogenetic, biochemical and other questions you can ask about why that's true, but it does seem to be true. Now the change, the intensification in one sense is often or always a temporal change, a difference between now and a moment ago, but it can also be a figure ground contrast where you miss somebody horribly, but then you think about how much they love you and how much you love them, and against this background of missing them, you're apart from them, you broke up with them, they've died, come these moments when you feel how much the love that was there still is there, and that contrast effect, that figure ground effect, can cause kama muta, as in moments of nostalgia when you're separated from those people or from those times, but you feel a moment of sudden connection. Okay, so it's the suddenness is required, right? And it can be, the intensification can be a restoration, like you were apart, like in the soldier videos. It can be suddenly somebody says something that they've never said to you before about how much they love you, or a kindness from a stranger where you had no relationship and now you feel a sense of like, oh my God, to hear somebody who cares about me. Or even, and we've shown this in some nice studies, you're walking along and you see a little kitten, right? And you had no relationship or awareness of this animal, but the cuteness of the kitten, your heart goes out to them almost the way it would in a very small way, to the way it would if you had a baby or something. So it goes from zero to something. Now you don't love the kitten the way you love your baby, but there's a sudden intensification, right? From zero to something, okay? Kama muta has a number of identifying features. So one is this appraisal that I've just mentioned, right? That you perceive a sudden intensification of communal sharing. And I should say that can be that my heart goes out to the kitten or my baby who's asleep, doesn't even know I'm there right now, right? Or you do something kind to me, right? Or we do something in synchrony. We're rowing the boat or we're playing music or singing in harmony, and suddenly we feel one. And interestingly enough, it can also occur when I see complete strangers, like in the videotape. I don't know who these soldiers are and their children are, or Pixar characters, when Wall-E and Eve, who I understand are not real, right? And if they're real, they're robots, right? But nevertheless, when they suddenly connect, when their communal sharing relationship connects it's an interesting fact, but then I can feel very strong kama muta, as some of you might have when you watch this video, where it's between other people, and then that occurs. Okay, so one is this appraisal. That's one characteristic feature, that you perceive a sudden intensification of a communal sharing relationship. Another distinctive feature is that it's quite a positive emotion. Now, the emotion itself is positive. It may occur in a moment with other emotions as well. So you may be feeling sad about how you miss somebody, right? But the moment of kama muta is a positive moment, okay? So if you said, how have you been feeling in the last minute? The answer might be, well, some sadness and some happiness, but if you narrow it down to the kama muta moment, it's positive, okay? And that we've shown in a number of experiments, including one that Thomas is not going to talk about, but it's published, you can look at. It's a positive emotion in several senses. First of all, just people tell you it's positive. Okay, they have all kinds of positive things to say about it. People behaviorally seek out opportunities to experience it. If they've had the experience in some context, they seek out opportunities to experience it again. And then they try to give it to other people, right? They say, oh, come watch this video, or come to my church and feel, God's love, or let's come sing in my chorus together, okay? So you give it to other people. It's called sharing on social media, right? But it can exist in a context outside of social media. But people also like to experience it together with others, okay? It's somehow something that, yeah, you can definitely experience it by yourself, but you would like to ideally experience it with other people, and maybe that intensifies it. There are a number of characteristic bodily sensations and signs that occur in most people, but not everyone, and occur especially when the emotion is intense. And the specific sensations and signs vary a good deal between people, perhaps across situations, but certainly between people. The most characteristic is some kind of vague, well, not vague, some kind of positive experience in the center of the chest, which people often say is warm. Sometimes they say warm fuzzies or fuzzy or swelling or something like that. We have no idea what that is physiologically, but it's something people report, okay? But not everybody reports it, and I, for one, don't feel it. I'm not aware of ever having had this feeling, although it's the most common one that people report. Very often people get moist eyes or tears. Now, I'm sure none of you did watching these videos, but it can happen that you get moist eyes or tears. And this tells us something interesting about tears, actually, because folk psychology and some academic psychology would tell you that if people are crying, they must be sad. That's simply not true. People who have tears of Muta are not feeling sad. Okay? And then we could go on from there to say, well, what is the function of tears? Maybe the function of tears is to actually evoke Muta. But that's another story. People often get choked up, so they have a hard time telling you about what they're feeling, right? At a moment of, at the wedding or whatever. They get or a lump in the throat, a creaky voice. People often get goosebumps or chills, and we're still not sure whether chills and goosebumps are the same thing or different, but people use those words. It's the hair standing up. If you're speaking to people in the humanities and religious studies, they call it horripilation. But people call it chicken skin or whatever, depending on the culture. People often go like this, or like this, right? And it's not like this or like that, right? They go like this, and it's not like this either, right? Now, why do they do that? Well, it could be because of the warm feeling. I think, but I don't know how to prove, that it's a hug reflex. It's a hug the baby, hug somebody you love, and even if they're not there, it still goes with the feeling, like hug. Anyway, people do it. Some cultures this becomes a conventionalized sign that says, I come in affection and respect and friendliness, or I'm leaving you, but I'm holding you in my heart, or this is the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag or something. So it can become conventionalized, but even in cultures where there's no convention, people still do it. Sometimes people say something like, oh, right? And in different cultures, actually, it's phonologically different. So there's an Australian Aboriginal language where this has been mentioned in passing, and the phonology of it is completely different, but it occurs in the same situation. So then we would want to say, well, what is it? Are there some phonological features that are universal or not? And I'm not a phonologist. I don't know, and we also don't have enough reports of it from enough places. But sometimes people say that. If the emotion is very strong, people sometimes will tell you that they literally feel like they're walking on the moon, or sometimes people will really report a feeling of floating, of buoyancy. Usually people don't report this, but when the emotion is strong, it's quite common, but far from universal. And then people also often feel exhilarated. They just feel like, whoa, let's go, okay? Now, you may have none of those sensations and still have kama mutta. Okay? And that's theoretically important in terms of emotion theory, because many emotion theorists would say that emotions are the naming of sensations, but we have plenty of evidence that people sometimes, especially when the emotion isn't terribly strong, feel kama mutta but don't subjectively have any of those sensations. But also none of them individually, except maybe this warm feeling here, but none of the others are distinctive of kama mutta by itself. Right? So you can be crying because you just dropped a brick on your foot, or the firing squad is about to shoot you, right? Or you're horribly sad about the death of somebody, and so tears can be goosebumps can be. You can have goosebumps from sexual arousal. You can have it from fear, right? You can have it from the sense of the uncanny, like, whoa, I just think I saw a ghost here, and so forth and so on. So the fact that you have goosebumps doesn't tell you that it's kama mutta. The fact that you have tears doesn't tell you that it's kama mutta. But if you have a warm feeling here, and goosebumps, and tears, and you're choked up a little bit, and, your hand is going like this and so forth, now we're pretty sure you very likely have kama mutta. And or if I put you in a situation where you all report that you perceive a sudden intensification of communal sharing, and you have tears, and you have goosebumps, and you have a warm feeling in the chest and so forth, so they're correlated across persons, then probably many of the people, most of them are feeling kama mutta. But there is no one sign or sensation that by itself is sufficient. So first there's the appraisal. Then there's the sensations that are correlated with it, and then there are a lot of labels. But the labels don't correspond one-to-one. They depend on the dialect of the speaker's age. They very much depend on the situation. People have different words for this. So if you go to the Vietnam War Memorial, it may give you a feeling that you would call patriotic, right? But at your wedding, as you're walking back down the aisle, you wouldn't say to your true love, oh, I feel so patriotic, right? When it's evoked by a memory, you call it nostalgia. But again, probably not a good idea as you're walking down the aisle to say to your true love, oh, such nostalgic feelings I'm having. She's going to say, for which wedding are you feeling nostalgic? Okay, so it has names in many languages, but they tend to be very context specific. So nostalgia refers to kama mutta evoked by a memory, but it doesn't, patriotism refers to kama mutta in connection to the sudden intensification of communal sharing with your nation. And then there might be, I'm feeling, if you go to a football game and they win, you might be feeling a sense of pride, right? In the sense that you feel so proud to be from Florida State Seminole, but you wouldn't call it pride in some other context, right? But also there may be no label for kama mutta in a given language in a given context. So a graduate student of ours has done a couple of wonderful studies showing that the predominant, people may feel many emotions, but the predominant emotional reaction that people have to cute animals is kama mutta. But people will tell you they have an emotion, and they'll tell you they have goosebumps and tears and so forth from watching kitten videos. But then you say, what emotion? They say, I don't know. So they don't have a name for it that comes readily to mind. Now, if you ask people, language is flexible and powerful. Eventually, people can find some way to talk about it, right? But there's nothing readily accessible in that context in this language. And we find that across languages, that the words for it are context specific. And that many languages, so here's English, just roughly schematically, and here's a bunch of the words and signs that people have for kama mutta. Well, none of them always refer to kama mutta. All of them sometimes refer to other emotions or other affects that aren't even emotions. So what we're calling kama mutta is often labeled by burning in the bosom, which is what a Mormon would call it in a religious context. But maybe Mormons have burning in the bosom when they're feeling awe or some other feeling, I don't know. Sweet sorrow or compassion or touching, and so forth and so on. So people have many different words, and the implication of that, is that there's no particular, how would you choose one of those particular words to label this? And so we don't. We don't use an English lexeme. But also, in different languages, there are different terms that encompass different aspects of kama muta, so that moving can be translated into French more or less as être ému, but it doesn't mean exactly the same thing. And French has this wonderful word s'attendrir, to tenderize oneself. So when you see the baby, you know, you're s'attendri, right? You're made tender, right? But well, what is the English equivalent? Well, I have tender feelings. So, but that's not exactly the same, right? So not only within languages, but across languages, you get a multiplicity of terms that don't map one-to-one onto each other. So moreover, in a number of languages, it's actually quite hard to find a word for this, at least in some contexts. So when I gave a talk a couple of years ago in Istanbul on this to a room packed with social and clinical psychologists, they all were saying, yeah, I know what that emotion is. And then at the end, I said, do you have any questions? And they all turned to each other, and for half an hour they had this vociferous exchange about what would we call this in Turkish, right? So in Hebrew, we have a colleague who's been collaborating with us. It took her months to decide what would be a good way to it's not that she didn't understand what the emotion was. It was just like, what would we call this? And in other Semitic languages, like Arabic, Arabic has many dialects. It's not just one language. And I don't know about, I don't speak Arabic, and I haven't studied all the different dialects of it. But in the context of music, especially music with Sufi roots, and in the context of Sufism, of union with divinity, there's a very nuanced vocabulary for this emotion. In other contexts, people say, oh, I don't know. If you show them the videos, people will have the emotional reaction. There's no doubt about whether they're, but then you ask them to name it, and they sit and think, and eventually, you know, one person says, well, you might call it this, and then you show the next person the video, and they say, I don't know. And then, well, you could call it this, I guess, but they don't agree, and they don't have a word that comes to mind. Now, I'm sure there's some dialect where in some, you know, they do, maybe. Ancient Greek, it turns out, represents this emotion it's represented in the whole last half of the Odyssey is about, you know, this emotion occurs over and over again when Odysseus comes home after 20 years with the shepherd, with his son, with the dog, with the nursemaid, with the Penelope finally. But they actually had no word for it. So it was a very common trope in ancient Greek literature, but without a name for it. In Hindi Urdu, I spent an hour talking to the person who supervises the teaching of Hindi and Urdu at UCLA, who's completely bilingual. And even I'd given her heads up a week ahead of time as to what I want to talk about. As I was walking out the door, she said, wait a minute, you could call it this, you know? And she came up with a Bollywood term, which she said it doesn't, you know, people have started to use because it comes out of Bollywood. But basically, Hindi Urdu speakers mostly have a very hard time coming up with anything. And I have a colleague who speaks Bicol from the central Philippines. He still hasn't found a word for that. So the fact that there are languages and contexts in which this emotion has no accessible name, and also that you can have this emotion without any subjective sensations, kind of puts the kibosh on the theory that emotions are essentially the labeling of sensations. That just can't be, at least in the case of this emotion. Now, that's not to say that when people feel kama muta and have sensations in many languages, in many contexts, they do have a name for it, but that's something that goes along with it and not something that is fundamental to what it is. Okay? Yeah, so all of and when there are words, they're context specific, and they're used for other things too sometimes, so that when people say they're moved, I don't know, 80% of the time they're talking about kama muta, but you know, sometimes they're talking about awe or something, or sadness or something else, right? Okay. Now, however, so that's why we use this term drawn from Sanskrit, kama muta, which means moved by love. Muta is as the same Indo-European root as moved, which, by the way, and this is interesting, and we'll think about this more in a moment, this Indo-European root, muta, moved, ému, right? Mouvoir, émouvoir. The same root is the root for moved, I feel moved, for emotion, and for motivation. So there's something there in the language that's providing a clue for us. Moreover, in a number of unrelated languages from different language families, the most typical word, although they may have other words for this emotion, means moved, touched, or stirred. So passive motion or contact gets invented or discovered over and over again, not in the majority of languages, but nevertheless in different, Now this could in principle be a case of borrowing, but it doesn't seem like it because it's used over and over again in language families that don't have a lot of contact and so forth. It's not true of all languages, and not even the majority of languages, but these synecdoches, in other words, using a sense of the experience to name to name the emotion, right? The part for the whole, seem to be used over and over again. Now, why? I don't know. And what it is about this emotion, what it has to do with passive displacement, passive contact, or passive mixing up, stirring, I'm not sure. And so we've got some, we've got some just so stories about that. We could talk about that. Maybe it's from infant experiences of being moved and touched, stirred. I'm not sure. We don't usually stir my baby, but nevertheless, that seems to be the case. Okay, so Kamamuta is evoked by the sudden intensification of communal sharing. That's the appraisal. There are certain sensations that are associated with it, but all of those are correlated. None of those are correlated 100% with it, right? And there are some individual differences, presumably, probably some gender differences in those and so forth. Maybe hormonal effects, we don't know yet. And then a bunch of labels, which depends on the language you speak and the context and so forth. And none of the labels just can be used one-to-one, and that's why we use this word, kamamuta. Then it has motivational effects, okay? It generates affective devotion and moral commitment to communal sharing. And the emotion itself typically lasts 10 seconds, 30 seconds, maybe a minute at the outside, but the devotion and commitment last much longer. And that makes sense if, as we speculate, and it's only speculation, the phylogenetic origin of this is maternal bonding. So you have, if you're a mammal, and you've got to connect to this baby right away and just love it in an unlimited way, or the baby dies. And it can't wait. It has to happen instantly, despite the pain that you've gone through and you maybe still be feeling, despite the fear and anxiety maybe that you're feeling connected with that pain, despite your utter exhaustion and everything else. Something has to overcome all of that and make you just take care of this baby instantly, and then forever, not just for the next 10 minutes, but for a very long time, right? And so it may be a generalization of that to pair bonding, paternal bonding, sibling helpers at the nest, and making that more flexibly connected to culture. That is the phylogenetic source of this. We're still looking for fossils of this emotion, but haven't found any yet. Yeah. If somebody does something very kind to me and I feel sudden kamamuta, right? Or if I've had a baby and here I am holding this baby and a lot of this devotion and commitment is focused on that person, right? But it seems to diffuse. So then I just feel kind and generous and sweet, and I like to hug anybody who wants to be hugged. And somebody comes up and says, "Can I borrow $1?" I say, "Sure, I have 10." So one of the things we don't understand both functionally and, and empirically yet is exactly what determines how broadly this emotion, this devotion and commitment motivation extends. So these 5 features, these 5 aspects form a configuration, right? So the appraisal, the constellation of characteristic sensations, the positivity in all senses, the set of partially synonymous labels, if the language provides a label at all in that context, and then the ensuing motives. When you have all those together, we have Muta, right? And based on these, we've developed in several stages, gradually over 3 or 4 years now, an instrument, a self-report questionnaire. Ideally, we'd like someday to go beyond self-report, but that's as far as we can get so far, that we have tested now in lots of studies, but most recently in a paper that's due out to appear in Cognition and Emotion in the next week or so. Oh, Emotion, sorry. That's due out to appear in any day now, but we can give you advanced copies if you want. That reports on 3,542 participants in 19 countries in 15 different languages. So this can be measured in lots of languages, right? Even despite all these problems, right? You can still ask people if they have goosebumps. And it turns out that, well, that's not quite so simple, because the word in one language may mean goosebumps of fear and doesn't mean other kind of goosebumps. And there are a lot of translation issues, but it is possible. And you get the same factor structure. And you get the same factor structure not only for watching videos, but for when people remember. In 7 of the nations, people reported not on, it wasn't, we used this instrument not for, in 12 of them we used the instrument while we showed people videos, but in 7 people reported events from their own lives, events of positive tears, which turn out to be mostly Muta experiences, and you get the same factor structure. So this works in a lot of places. We don't yet know if it works in South America or in Greenland, but it works in a lot of places. We'd be happy to share this with you. It's be published in a week, and yeah. But anyway, you ask about the sensations. You ask in colloquial terms about sudden intensification of communal sharing. You ask about the motivation. You ask about the positivity, and then you ask some relevant labels. And the labels, of course, are different in different cultures. And for some cultures, it's hard to find good labels. But that works. It works really well. What kind of evidence do we have besides this measure, besides this instrument? Well, we've done a lot of participant observation. So I've had students go to Sufi and participate in worship in Sufi mosques and Pentecostal churches, at poetry readings, in Alcoholics Anonymous groups, and in volunteering in Meals on Wheels, and various other contexts. So we've used participant observation, which is really, really valuable method for studying emotions, because you don't just interview, you go and experience it and then try to see if your experience, which could be different, it could be, it could be that you're experiencing something or not experiencing something, that could differ from the other people who are there, but nevertheless, it's a wonderful window to see what is evoking this emotion and what it feels like and what it means to you, and then you can kind of check with your informants and see, oh, she's crying too, or wow, she just reached over and hugged me. That's what I was about to do, And you can use participant observation very effectively. We've done lots and lots of interviews, both formal and informal. And my own part of this, besides the ethnographies and so forth, has been doing what's often called ethnology. So reading about, looking for this emotion, which is not always easy to reliably identify, but nevertheless looking for it in primary sources, the Jataka tales of the Buddha's past lives and his incredible loving kindness, and the earth getting goosebumps at the kindness of the Buddha, or Krishna worship, the original, the Bhagavad Gita and so forth, and then reading ethnographies, reading histories. The French delegates in 1780 creating a new nation, feeling this sense of like, wow, this is our nation, and walking up signing the new Constitution and kissing it and weeping over it. Okay? So looking for ethnographies, historical descriptions of this, and then of course, novels, blogs, and so forth and so on. And then we've also done some studies asking people to keep track of events like this in their life and report them. So we talk about what we're looking for, and we just ask them to keep a diary of one kind or another. Or so you can just start talking to somebody and say, well, when's the last time you had positive tears? Or when's the last time you had a warm feeling here? Or when's the last time you suddenly felt close to somebody? And then lots and lots and lots of experiments that Thomas Schubert and Beate Siept and their graduate students and colleagues have organized. Just lots of experiments. A great many of them on MTurk, but also some with actual living face-to-face participants. And Johanna Blumster and Thomas Schubert will tell you about a couple of those. The disposition for kama mutta, we think, is innate and universal in human beings, but it's always unnecessarily culturally implemented, because there's no way to know, for the innate system to know, what communal sharing relationships exist. Are you in a patrilineal society or a matrilineal or a bilateral society or some other kinship system? Are there age sets here, and is that important, right? Is there a God? Right? And does the God love you or just discipline you? The innate system doesn't know about Alcoholics Anonymous, and it doesn't know about Martin Luther King. So the system is innate, but it's super tuned to the cultural precedents and prototypes and paradigms. And then culture provides, and we'll come back to this in just a moment, the opportunities to experience this, right? The culture shapes when communal sharing relationships could intensify, and then the culture provides indices of the intensification, and then it tells what should you do if you feel devoted and committed. Well, that depends on what kind of relationship it is. Should you go share should you go on a raid with people and risk your lives with these people? Should you share the cow that you just sacrificed? Or what is it that that devotion and commitment consists in? And then beyond that, sort of how you demonstrate it and communicate it. But then also the culture tells you about what it means to experience this. In a religious context, in a particular religion, it may mean that you are now really fully you've realized your potential as a religious being, and or that this means that God loves you personally, which he might not have, right? Or is it embarrassing, like, oh, I'm a tough guy, I shouldn't be crying, right? Or as it was from roughly 1770 to 1830 or 1840 in North America and Europe, does it show as a man how sophisticated you are, how cultured you are, that you cry in the theater, of course, because that's what cultured guys do, right? Or in a political context, it shows that you are a patriot. Or at the football game, it shows that you're a loyal Seminole or Bruin, back where I'm from, right? And how is it? How is the display of it elaborated and perfected? And I won't go into that, but the display of kama mutta is aestheticized in some cultures. It's made into a beautiful thing which people value, including the weeping itself. So in many cultures, displaying kama mutta, people practice it. All across Africa and the Middle East, women ululate when they feel this, and join others when they feel this, and that takes a lot of practice to do that right. And lament and other forms of the display of kama mutta can take years of practice and be perfected and admired when they're done right. And so the kama mutta disposition wouldn't be adaptive if it weren't tuned to these cultural parameters. And you can say that the psychological disposition expects these cultural parameters and is looking for them, because it otherwise doesn't know when communal sharing is intensified or what to do about it. And in that way, it's a little bit like the language learning mechanism. There's a lot of argument as to how localized in the brain, if at all, and how specialized it is, and Human beings, however we do this, learn language without any teaching. In every culture, babies just expose them to a little bit of speech for a couple of years and they learn language. But what do they learn? Not universal grammar. They learn a particular language. So the innate mechanism for language acquisition is a mechanism for acquiring something cultural. And I would say that that's true of Kama Muta, that the mechanism is a mechanism for feeling this emotion in cultural ways, in a cultural context. So there are enormous number of practices and institutions, roles, arts, and artifacts which evolve in the niche of this psychological disposition. They exist, they expand, they diffuse, they persist because they evoke this emotion. And when they evoke this emotion, people say, oh, I want to do that again. And they say, oh, come with me. They recruit other people and they remember them. You know, like other emotions, Kama Muta draws your attention and locks itself in your memory. So cultural practices, roles, arts, artifacts that evoke Kama Muta are likely to diffuse and endure. And many of them are the things that we call inspiring. Okay, so there are things that we call drivers, which are these culturally evolved practices that evolved in the niche of Kama Muta, and practices around childbirth, you know, posting cute kittens, in fact, domesticating animals in the, you know, cats and dogs in the first place. The world religions have, you know, evolved, culturally evolved in part with reference to this. And then, you know, practices, specific practices like pilgrimage, California cry dates, when women get together and say, oh, my boyfriend is being such a jerk, and I'm going to never get into grad school. I've got some ice cream. Do you have some tissues? Yes, and I'll bring The Fault in Our Stars. And then we'll all go and cry together, okay? And, you know, lots of media exist. Poetry readings, which we've also done participant observation in, sentimental literature, lots of music, that's a whole story in itself. Various kinds of the sense of belonging in addiction and recovery groups and so forth and so on. And many more specific practices in different cultures that you find all over the world exist because they evoke this emotion and would not exist if they didn't, I think we can say. And you find this in lots and lots and lots of contexts. If you'd like to read about it, I'm hoping that Cambridge University Press will decide to publish my book and you can read about it. It's also present in marketing. Let me for a second, I only have a second more, but hang on a second. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have, yeah. Oh, stop worrying about that. Okay, so, I don't know if you've seen this before.
Wise men say only fools rush in. They can't help falling in love with you.
Well, yeah, see? Well, there are lots of things we don't know about, and we don't know about the ontogeny of it. We don't know about the phylogeny of it. We don't know when in your period you're most likely to feel this. We don't know whether males, when their testosterone is high at 7 in the morning, are less likely to feel it than they are when it's lower later in the day. And also, we're interested in how it relates to sister emotions. So communal sharing is one fundamental form of relationship, but what about others? What about when authority ranking suddenly intensifies? We think there might be an emotion, which you might colloquially call awe, but you might call something else. We'll call it alpha or something, right? When you suddenly look up to God, or you're the greatest hero you ever saw, or you see something just mind-blowingly astonishing that somebody does, okay? So we don't, we're just beginning to study this, but we wanted to share what we begin to know, and Thomas and Johanna will share more after lunch. So thank you.